Last time, Marius fought a significant battle against the Cimbri. Today, we will explore the fallout of the Battle of Vercellae and its lasting consequences for the relationship between Marius, Catullus, and Sulla. The critical victory at Vercellae appeared not to be Marius's to claim. According to our ancient sources, Marius's troops were blinded by a dust storm on the battlefield and missed their attempted charge at the enemy. Having failed to contact the enemy, they wandered aimlessly on the battlefield for some time thereafter. The brunt of the German attack was absorbed by Sulla and Catullus's forces. They thoroughly beat the enemy back, saving the day for the Romans. Problems began almost immediately after the battle. Marius, as the senior military commander in theater, legally owned all of the spoils of war. But because he played virtually no part in the victory, the most glorious spoils, those of the enemy's standards and trumpets, were brought to the camp of Catullus and Sulla. This led to argument and aggravation on all sides. Sulla and Catullus's troops demanded their fair share of the glory, but Marius had been a military superhero for so many years at this point, it was natural for everyone back at Rome to give him all of the credit. Worse yet, there were voices in the capital calling for Marius to be granted an individual triumph, rather than having one jointly held between him and Catullus. Here, Marius's political instincts kicked in, and he demanded Catullus receive his fair share of the recognition. Plutarch supposes that this was not just because Catullus deserved it, but because Marius was frightened of Catullus's troops, and their reaction if spurned. If true, this heralded a new development in the Roman Republic, that of a commander afraid of his own troops. Unfortunately for the Romans, that kind of fear would become a hallmark of the Roman military for the rest of their history. As his most recent illegal consulship was coming to a close, Marius wanted one more. He wanted this fresh consulship to fulfill his promise of land grants to his veterans. The subject of granting land was a touchy one at Rome. There were a number of reasons why. Firstly was the question of eligibility. Most Roman armies were made of a mixture of Roman citizens and Italian allies from other city-states. Should land be allotted to Roman citizens alone and not the allies? If that were the case, then why should the allied cities provide any manpower for any future Roman army? But if the Romans were to provide land to the allies, does that mean that they should also get citizenship? There were many in Rome who did not want to give either land or citizenship to landless Romans, let alone allies. This debate about land had been going on for some time before Marius' sixth consulship. The problem of land distribution began somewhere between the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, when the Romans conquered the Italian peninsula. Many of the conquered city-states in Italy were made official Roman allies by treaty, which obligated them to provide soldiers for Roman armies in times of war. In exchange for this, the Italian allies would receive a share of the spoils and local independence from the Roman Senate. Each time the Romans conquered a new part of Italy, the landholdings of the conquered allies were designated as ager publicus, or public land. However, the Romans rarely enforced their rights to this land far from the city. Instead, they rented it to wealthy nobles, either Roman or allied, who formed enormous farms known as latifundia. When the Romans did settle veterans on conquered lands, they did so in colonia, which is where we get the English word colony from. Roman colonia were often placed in strategic locations and acted as sources of experienced troops in the event of resumed hostilities in a freshly conquered land. Marius' plan to make a new colony out of Transalpine Gaul was not so controversial. It was the other language in the bill that caused a stir. He closely collaborated with the tribune of the plebs for the year, Lucius Saturninus, and the aspiring praetor Gaius Servilius Glaucia. Both these men favored an agenda of land distribution and enfranchisement of Marius's veterans. But the bill granted Marius alone the power to grant citizenship to as many as 300 veterans in each colony that was to be established. The power to grant citizenship was not one that any politician typically held. Saturninus and Glaucia likely had designs on retaining such a power for themselves once Marius was no longer in public life. The potential for the abuse of this power was obvious. If any one Roman politician were granted unilateral authority to mint new citizens, he would immediately become a superpower in the Roman government. This is because he could stuff the voting tribes with his own freshly minted citizens who presumably would vote for anything he told them to. For these reasons, then, Saturninus and Glaucia can scarcely be seen as anything less than political radicals and revolutionaries. As if their one revolutionary plan wasn't enough, they were also working on another. They included language in their land bill requiring all members of the Senate to swear an oath that they would accept whatever the concilium plebis decided, and that they would not oppose the enactment of the law in any way. This extra stipulation was not without precedent, but it did raise tensions between the plebs and the nobility. For one, it suggested that the Senate could not be counted on to uphold the law, which made the addition of the oath little more than a public attack on the integrity of the Senate. But perhaps more worrisome was the implication that the Senate was a subordinate body to the concilium plebis. That would be a revolutionary change to the Roman system of government if it were to pass. Marius initially opposed the legislation, saying that it was beneath the dignity of the Senate to force their opinion rather than to let the body express its own free will. But when the Senate reconvened, Saturninus asked the senators to come forth and take the oath. Those senators sympathetic to the cause of the plebs, the so-called populares faction, swore the oath in turn. When it came time for Marius to swear, he gave a long speech, hemming and hawing over the matter, until finally he said that he would take the oath after all, since it was indeed a law, and laws are worth following. Aren't they? Marius's support for this radical transformation of the government made him immediately radioactive in the Senate. The alliance between Marius, Glaucia, and Saturninus all of a sudden seemed to be more trouble than it was worth. The unrestrained political ambitions of Saturninus and Glaucia weren't helping the situation either. Saturninus attempted to illegally run for a third tribuneship, while Glaucia, still holding the office of praetor, began to campaign for consul. This was flagrantly illegal, because according to Roman law, one could not run for consul while still holding the office of praetor. If either of these men were able to win their intended office, there is little doubt that they would have been successful in their radical changes to the Roman government. But Marius seems to have recognized the danger and wouldn't have any of it. Seeing his popularity decline so precipitously after swearing his oath publicly, Marius knew that he had to extricate himself from the alliance. That was easier said than done. While Glaucia insisted on his candidacy for consulship, the Senate, led by Marius, declared it illegal. Rather than accept the Senate's decision, Glaucia tried to use the concilium plebis to override Marius, using the exact same tactic that Marius once did, the plebiscite. If you need a refresher for how Marius used the plebiscite to usurp Metellus's army, you can listen to that episode here. Glaucia convened the concilium plebis for the purposes of passing his plebiscite. He did it on the Capitoline Hill, not because it was the usual location, but because he knew he might come under attack, and presumably the hill was more defensible. The Senate decided to break up the meeting, seeing it as an act of rebellion. To do so, they issued their most powerful judgment, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which essentially empowered the consul to use whatever means necessary to deal with an emergency at hand. With the Senatus Consultum Ultimum in hand, Marius levied troops and besieged Glaucia and Saturninus on the Capitoline Hill. He ordered the men to disperse their illegal gathering of the Concilium Plebis. But neither Glaucia nor Saturninus would obey. Marius only forced their surrender by interrupting the water supply to the Capitoline Hill and threatening a long siege. He marched the two men down to the Senate House, where they were to be tried as enemies of the state. What happened next is not quite certain. One theory goes that before the trial could begin, a mob stoned Saturninus and Glaucia to death on the same day. Others say that Saturninus was lynched by a group of senators, and that Glaucia was able to escape for a short while before he was found likewise murdered by a mob. At any rate, Marius's political career was irretrievably damaged by this episode of lawlessness. He would not run for the consulship in the following year, but instead removed himself from the city. He set sail for Asia to fulfill a vow he had made to Magna Mater. He promised the goddess to sacrifice in her temple in Galatia, now in modern Turkey. Our sources are largely silent about the next decade of Marius's life. Rather, they spend much time and energy trying to locate the cause of the social war in the 90 CE. Marius next appears as a character in that conflict, but there's no reason to think that he had taken a step back from public life in the interim. More likely than not, Marius remained a venerable elder statesman for the entire decade before he would take the field again in 90 BCE. But that is a story for another episode. Join me next time as we follow Marius through his trials and tribulations during the social war. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.